Between 1941 and 1945, the Pacific Theater witnessed one of the most brutal naval conflicts in human history. Two nations found themselves locked in an escalating struggle for maritime supremacy. Japan, a rising imperial power with a formidable navy built on decades of technological advancement and naval dominance, and Canada, a nation that transformed itself from a minor naval player into a significant contributor to Allied victory. The story of their confrontation, particularly through the lens of Pacific convoy operations, reveals far more than simple military statistics or casualty figures. It demonstrates how doctrine, strategy, industrial capacity, and geographical advantage combined to determine which navy would endure longer under the grinding pressure of sustained oceanic warfare. Japan entered World War II with what many considered the most powerful fleet in the world. Yet by the war's end, that magnificent navy lay shattered and dispersed across the ocean floor. Canada, meanwhile, though never the primary naval power in the Pacific, managed to contribute meaningfully to convoy operations and emerged with its navy intact and battle-hardened. This script examines the fundamental differences between these two naval powers during Pacific convoy operations, exploring why the Japanese Navy, despite its initial superiority, collapsed under the weight of American industrial might and Allied strategy, while the Canadian Navy, though facing its own enormous challenges, survived and contributed to the ultimate defeat of Japanese naval power. The answer lies not in a single factor, but in a complex interplay of strategic doctrine, industrial capacity, technological development, and the willingness of democratic nations to adapt and learn from their mistakes. The naval powers at war's beginning. When Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Japanese combined fleet represented the culmination of decades of naval development and strategic planning. The Imperial Japanese Navy had emerged from the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 with a reputation as one of the world's most formidable naval forces, and in the intervening decades, it had only grown more powerful and technologically sophisticated. By 1941, Japan possessed a fleet that included some of the most advanced battleships, aircraft carriers, and destroyers in the world. The Yamato-class battleships were the largest and most heavily armed battleships ever constructed. Japanese carrier doctrine had advanced to the point where naval aviators were among the most skilled in the world, and the Zero fighter aircraft represented a quantum leap in aviation technology. The Japanese Navy operated under a strategic doctrine that emphasized tactical excellence, individual pilot skill, and the concept of victory through crushing numerical and technological advantage. Japanese naval officers studied naval history extensively and believed that their superior training and Bushido warrior ethic would ultimately prevail over any opponent. However, this doctrine contained critical vulnerabilities that would only become apparent as the war progressed. The Japanese Navy planned for a swift, decisive campaign that would eliminate American naval power in the Pacific and secure a defensive perimeter around Japanese conquests. The strategy depended on achieving overwhelming victory quickly, because Japan understood its industrial base could never match American production capacity in a prolonged war. Japanese leaders believed that if they could crush American naval power within the first few months of conflict, the United States would negotiate a peace settlement recognizing Japanese dominance in Asia. This strategic vision, while logical given Japan's industrial constraints, ultimately proved to be a fatal miscalculation that underestimated American resolve and resilience. Canada's naval situation in 1941 presented a starkly different picture. The Royal Canadian Navy was, by the standards of the time, a modest force. Canada had developed its naval service gradually during the 20th century, having separated from direct British naval administration in 1910. By 1941, the RCN had grown into a capable but relatively small force centered on a handful of modern destroyers and numerous smaller escort vessels, corvettes, and minesweepers. Canada's naval strategy was fundamentally shaped by its geographic proximity to the United States and its participation in the Battle of the Atlantic against German submarines. When Japan entered the war and extended conflict to the Pacific, Canada's primary naval theater remained the Atlantic, where Canadian ships fought German U-boats protecting vital convoy routes between North America and Britain. However, Canada could not ignore the Pacific threat entirely, particularly after Japanese forces occupied the Aleutian Islands in 1942 and threatened the Canadian west coast. The Royal Canadian Navy adapted to Pacific operations by deploying several destroyer squadrons to the Pacific, establishing naval stations along the British Columbia coast, and integrating Canadian naval forces into broader Allied command structures dominated by American naval power. Unlike Japan, Canada had no illusions about achieving naval dominance through its own efforts. Instead, the Canadian Navy operated as part of a broader Allied coalition, with strategic planning and major operations directed by American naval commanders. This integration into Allied command structures meant that Canadian naval forces adopted American doctrine, tactics, and operational procedures. The Canadian Navy's role in Pacific convoys was therefore subsidiary to American naval strategy, but this very subordination contained a critical advantage. It meant Canadian forces benefited from American technological development, received superior American training, and had access to American industrial production. Where Japan pursued a strategy of tactical independence and strategic autonomy, Canada accepted strategic subordination in exchange for access to Allied resources and planning. This fundamental difference in strategic approach would prove decisive as the war progressed and attrition began to weigh more heavily on both powers. Industrial capacity and the mathematics of attrition. The fundamental difference between Japanese and Canadian naval survival during Pacific convoy operations ultimately derived from industrial capacity and the mathematics of naval attrition. Japan entered World War II as a rapidly industrializing nation with a substantial manufacturing base, but that base paled in comparison to the combined industrial capacity of the United States, Britain, and their allies. American industrial production during World War II reached levels that were almost incomprehensible to contemporary observers. The United States produced over 88,000 tanks during the war, constructed more than 18 million small arms, and built more tonnage of merchant shipping than Germany could sink. In the naval sphere, American shipyards constructed over 141 major warships during the war years, in addition to hundreds of smaller craft. More significantly, American shipbuilding capacity allowed for rapid replacement of losses and continuous modernization of naval forces. When American ships were damaged or sunk, the American industrial machine could replace them within months, and sometimes weeks. Japanese shipbuilding, while respectable, operated at a fraction of American capacity. Japan produced approximately 25,000 ships of all types during the war, but the majority were merchant vessels and smaller craft. Japanese warship production lagged far behind American output, and crucially, Japanese shipyards could not match American speeds of construction. A Japanese fleet carrier required 2 to 3 years to construct and outfit, whereas American shipyards could produce fleet carriers in 18 months and sometimes less. More importantly, American naval aviation training programs produced hundreds of replacement pilots annually, whereas Japanese pilot training programs, hampered by fuel shortages and operational losses, could not maintain numerical parity with American recruitment and training. Canada's role in this industrial equation was modest but meaningful. Canadian shipyards, while far smaller than American facilities, contributed substantially to Allied naval production, particularly in the construction of smaller vessels used in convoy escort operations. Canadian shipyards produced numerous corvettes, minesweepers, and other escort vessels that complemented British and American warship production. More significantly, Canada participated in the broader North American industrial base that fed American naval expansion. Canadian industrial production of raw materials, processed goods, and manufactured components supported American military production, which in turn supplied Canadian forces operating in the Pacific. This integration into the North American industrial complex meant that Canadian naval forces, though numerically modest, operated with access to superior American technology, training, and spare parts. When a Canadian destroyer required repairs or modernization, it could access American dockyards and American technical expertise. When Canadian naval personnel required advanced training, they could attend American naval schools and aviation academies. This seamless integration into American industrial and technological systems meant that Canadian naval forces remained modern and capable throughout the war, even though Canada itself was not producing the most advanced naval technology. The contrast with Japan was stark. As Japanese industry began to suffer from American bombing campaigns, submarine attacks on merchant shipping, and resource shortages, the Japanese Navy's ability to maintain and upgrade its vessels deteriorated. By 1944 and 1945, Japanese naval vessels frequently operated without adequate spare parts, ammunition supplies were constrained, and fuel shortages became so severe that training operations ceased entirely. The Japanese Navy's great carriers, those magnificent ships that had struck at Pearl Harbor and dominated the early campaigns, increasingly found themselves unable to operate because there was insufficient fuel to launch training exercises or to position them at major fleet anchorages. This industrial attrition was invisible in the casualty statistics but was ultimately more destructive to Japanese naval power than any single battle or campaign. Japan's navy was literally being strangled by American industrial capacity, while Canadian naval forces were being sustained and enhanced by access to that same industrial machine. Convoy operations and tactical doctrine. The actual conduct of Pacific convoy operations reveals significant differences in how Canadian and Japanese naval forces approached the strategic challenge of protecting merchant shipping and maintaining supply lines across vast oceanic distances. Convoy operations are fundamentally defensive in character, but they are also critically important to any military power attempting to project force across ocean distances. The United States, Japan, and Canada all recognized that whoever could protect their merchant shipping from enemy attack while disrupting enemy convoys would possess a decisive advantage in sustaining military operations across the vast Pacific. Japanese convoy operations were complicated by a fundamental strategic tension. The Imperial Navy had been built around the concept of achieving decisive fleet victory through concentrated action of the most powerful warships. Battleships, heavy cruisers, and aircraft carriers represented the apex of Japanese naval power, and naval strategy emphasized their employment in grand fleet actions. Convoy escort duties, by contrast, were unglamorous assignments that many Japanese naval officers viewed as secondary to the great naval campaigns. This cultural and strategic bias within the Japanese Navy meant that convoy escort operations often received inadequate resources and were frequently assigned to older vessels, less experienced crews, and officers on their way toward obsolescence. As American submarine and aircraft attacks increasingly threatened Japanese merchant shipping, the Japanese Navy found itself unable to provide adequate protection because the most capable vessels were committed to other operations or were being husbanded for future fleet actions that never materialized. The Japanese Navy also suffered from inadequate anti-submarine warfare doctrine and technology. While Japan possessed some effective anti-submarine weapons and tactics, the Navy's officer corps and tactical training emphasized air combat and surface warfare. As American submarines increasingly devastated Japanese merchant convoys, the Japanese Navy proved unable to adapt its doctrine and training quickly enough to effectively counter submarine threats. This was not entirely a failure of personnel or technology, but rather reflected fundamental deficiencies in the Navy's understanding of modern warfare and its inability to rapidly adjust strategic priorities when initial doctrinal concepts proved inadequate. Canadian convoy operations in the Pacific evolved differently, largely because Canada never attempted to conduct independent naval campaigns but instead integrated Canadian forces into American operational planning. Canadian escort vessels, predominantly small destroyer escorts and corvettes, were assigned to protect merchant convoys alongside American escort vessels and under overall American command. This integration meant that Canadian forces benefited from American operational planning, American anti-submarine warfare doctrine, and American technological advantages. The Canadian Navy, operating within the American command structure, rapidly adopted and implemented American anti-submarine tactics, which proved devastatingly effective against Japanese submarines. Japanese submarines, while dangerous and effective, operated under strategic constraints and doctrinal limitations that prevented them from being employed with maximum effectiveness against convoy operations. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized the targeting of warships rather than merchant vessels, and Japanese submarines were frequently employed on strategic reconnaissance missions rather than concentrated against merchant shipping. American and Canadian escort forces, by contrast, became increasingly proficient at detecting and destroying Japanese submarines through the application of improving radar technology, sonar equipment, and coordinated tactical responses developed through continuous experimentation and shared learning across the American naval establishment. By 1943 and 1944, when Japanese submarine threats to Allied convoys in the Pacific had become severe, the American-Canadian escort system had become sufficiently capable that Japanese submarine losses mounted while successful attacks on convoys declined. This was not because Japanese submarines or submariners were inferior to their American counterparts, but because the American convoy escort system, which included Canadian participants, had developed superior tactics, technology, and operational procedures for defeating submarine threats. The Canadian Navy's willingness to subordinate its operational independence to American command and planning, while potentially limiting Canadian strategic autonomy, meant that Canadian naval personnel operated with access to superior collective learning and planning resources, where Japanese naval officers were often unable or unwilling to adapt tactics in response to American innovations. Canadian officers participated in a continuous process of tactical innovation and improvement driven by American naval commands and shared throughout the Allied naval establishment. Attrition and surviving the grind. As World War II progressed from 1943 through 1945, the true test of naval power was not individual battles or tactical engagements, but rather the capacity to absorb losses and continue operating effectively. This grinding test of attrition revealed fundamental differences between Japanese and Canadian naval capacity. The Japanese Navy suffered devastating losses throughout the war. The loss of fleet carriers at the Coral Sea, Midway, and the Philippine Sea. The sinking of battleships at Guadalcanal and later in combat. The continuous loss of cruisers and destroyers in surface engagements. And the mounting toll of submarines, merchant vessels, and support ships lost to American attacks. Each loss represented not merely the destruction of a military asset, but the elimination of skilled personnel, experienced officers, and trained crew members who could not be rapidly replaced. By 1944, the Japanese Navy faced a crisis of personnel and training. As veteran ship captains and experienced sailors were killed in combat, they were replaced by progressively less experienced personnel who had received abbreviated training. Japanese pilot training programs, devastated by the loss of experienced aviators and constrained by fuel shortages, produced fewer and less capable pilots each year. The Japanese Navy's attempt to maintain naval aviation capabilities despite mounting pilot losses led to the deployment of kamikaze suicide attack programs, which represented not an innovation in tactics but rather an admission that Japan could no longer sustain conventional naval aviation operations. By the end of 1944, the Japanese Navy had suffered such catastrophic losses in ships, aircraft, and trained personnel that it was no longer capable of conducting effective large-scale fleet operations. The sinking of the battleship Yamato in April 1945, the flagship of Japanese naval power, symbolized the complete degradation of Japanese naval capacity. The ship was dispatched on a suicide mission to attack American forces, a fate that reflected the complete desperation of Japanese naval leadership. Canadian naval forces, by contrast, survived the grinding attrition of the war years with steadily improving capability. The Royal Canadian Navy suffered losses during Pacific convoy operations, though far less severe than Japanese losses. Canadian ships were damaged, some were sunk, and Canadian sailors died in combat against Japanese submarines and aircraft. However, Canadian naval losses were consistently replaced by new construction, and damaged vessels were repaired and returned to service. More importantly, Canadian naval personnel participated in a continuous process of learning and improvement driven by the American naval establishment. As naval combat techniques evolved, as new technologies such as improved radar and sonar came into service, and as operational procedures were refined through continuous experimentation, Canadian naval forces adapted and adopted these innovations. The Canadian Navy's officer corps participated in American naval command schools, studied American operational analyses of fleet actions and submarine warfare, and implemented American-derived tactical procedures. This meant that the Canadian Navy, though never dominant in Pacific naval operations, was always aligned with leading-edge naval practice and capability. When the war ended in August 1945, the Canadian Navy emerged as a capable, modern force that had participated in successful naval operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. Canadian escort vessels had contributed to the defeat of Japanese submarine threats. Canadian personnel had participated in countless convoy operations that maintained the flow of supplies across the Pacific, and Canadian ships had survived and remained in service. The fundamental difference was this: the Japanese Navy was destroyed by the weight of American industrial production and the superior strategic and doctrinal adaptation of American forces. The Canadian Navy survived because it was part of that American-led industrial and strategic apparatus. Japan's attempt to pursue strategic independence and tactical autonomy in naval warfare meant that Japanese forces could not benefit from the collective learning and industrial resources of a large alliance. Canada's acceptance of strategic subordination within the American-led alliance meant that Canadian forces benefited from access to superior industrial capacity, training resources, and collective operational knowledge. In the end, the Navy that survived longer was not the one that possessed the most impressive ships at the outset of the war, but rather the one that was integrated into a broader system capable of sustaining losses, adapting tactics, and maintaining the continuous production of replacement vessels and trained personnel. This lesson would shape naval strategy and alliance politics throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond.